One, we want to thank you for helping us out.
We're holding on, nothing left to hold on to.
She walked into that hospice room knowing he might not hear her. He was not conscious. The machines were breathing for both of them. The man who had built her career, fought her career, sued her for $3 million, and refused to speak to her for years. That man was lying still in a bed in Nashville, running out of hours. Dolly Parton reached for his hand. She had not come to argue. She had not come to collect. She had come because she had told the truth about this man 34 years earlier. In a song she wrote in 1973, on a piece of paper in a living room, while she searched for words gentle enough to survive what she knew was going to break his heart. She had come because the song said she would always love him. And Dolly Parton, in 61 years on this earth, had never once said something she did not mean. He made a small movement when she squeezed his hand. Just enough. And a few hours later, Porter Wayne Wagoner, the man who helped make her a star, the man who tried to take everything she built, the man who was more complicated than any story about him will ever fully capture, was gone. Here is the question that will stay with you long after this video ends. How does a woman write a farewell song that becomes a lawsuit and still hold the hand of the man who sued her when he is dying? That is not a simple story. That is not a villain and a hero. That is something much harder and much more real. And to understand it, you have to go back, not to the hospice, not to the courtroom, not even to the song, but to a small town in Missouri in 1927, where a boy grew up who would one day change everything for a little girl not yet born in the Tennessee mountains. If Dolly Parton has ever moved you, with a song, with a word, with the particular kind of grace she carries, stay with us. This is the story behind the story, and it is one of the most extraordinary in the history of American music. There is a particular kind of hunger that comes from growing up with very little in rural America. Not the hunger that passes by morning, but the kind that settles into a person's bones and never fully leaves. Porter Wayne Wagoner understood that hunger before he understood much else about the world. He was born on the 12th of August, 1927, in West Plains, Missouri, a small Ozark town where the economy moved at the speed of the seasons and ambition was considered, at best, a mild eccentricity. His family was not glamorous. They were not connected. They were working people in a working town, and Porter grew up understanding that the distance between where he was and where he wanted to be was not measured in miles. It was measured in sweat, in stubbornness, and in the willingness to make a fool of yourself in public until someone finally started listening. He started playing guitar as a boy, not as a hobby, as a mission. By the time he was a teenager, Porter Wagoner had already decided that music was not something he would do on the side of his real life. Music was the real life. Everything else was the side. He got his first radio spot on KWPM in West Plains while he was still working as a butcher's assistant. A detail so perfectly American it could have been invented, except it was not. He would finish his shift, scrub the smell of the counter off his hands, and go perform on local radio for next to nothing. Because next to nothing was more than he had been given, and he intended to make it work. That is the particular arithmetic of ambition in small-town America. You trade one kind of nothing for another kind of nothing until, if you are good enough and stubborn enough, the math finally changes. It changed for Porter Wagoner in 1951, when he signed with RCA Victor and released his first recordings. He was 23 years old. He was not yet the man in the rhinestone suit. He was not yet the host with the blonde pompadour and the television program that would reach more than 100 American cities. He was a young man from West Plains, Missouri, with a guitar and a radio voice and the specific, unshakable certainty that he was meant for something larger than a butcher counter. By 1952, he had his first charting single. By 1957, the Grand Ole Opry had welcomed him as a member, an institution that does not open its doors to ambition alone. It opens them to talent that has been proven, tested, and found worthy. Porter Wagoner walked through those doors at 30 years old, and he did not walk through them humbly. He walked through them in a nudie cone suit, covered in rhinestones and sequins, and embroidered designs that caught the light from 30 feet away. Because Porter Wagoner had decided very early on that if you are going to take up space in this world, you should take up space deliberately. The Porter Wagoner Show launched in 1960 and became one of the most successful country music television programs in American history. At its peak, it was syndicated in more than 100 cities across the United States, a number that, in the pre-cable, pre-satellite television landscape of the 1960s, represented something genuinely extraordinary. He was not a guest on someone else's stage. He was the host. He controlled the format, the guests, the pacing, the tone. Porter Wagoner, the boy from the Ozarks who had worked a butcher counter to afford radio time, had built an empire. And empires, as this story will make clear, have a particular way of shaping the people who build them. What he had built was real. What he had built was earned. And what he had built, starting in 1967, he would share with a 21-year-old woman from Sevier County, Tennessee, who would take everything he gave her, exceed every expectation he had ever held, and eventually become something he had not fully prepared himself for. Something larger than him. In 1967, Porter Wagoner had a problem. Norma Jean, the beloved female vocalist of the Porter Wagoner Show, the woman his audience had grown attached to over years of Saturday night television, had left the program to get married and step back from the road. The show had a hole in it. Not a small hole, a structural one. The format depended on a female voice to balance Wagoner's, to soften the edges of his presence, to give the program a warmth that he alone could not manufacture. He needed someone who could sing beside him without disappearing into his shadow. He had heard about Dolly Parton. Most people in Nashville had by then heard something, a voice coming out of Sevier County, Tennessee, a girl who had written her first song at age 6, who had performed on the Knoxville radio station WIVK at age 10, who had arrived in Nashville on the very morning after her high school graduation with a suitcase and a guitar, and the kind of absolute certainty that either marks a fool or a phenomenon. She had been in Nashville since 1964. She had been recording for Monument Records. She was 21 years old. And she was, even then, even before the Rhinestones, before the Wigs, before the crossover albums, already something that Nashville did not quite have a category for. Porter Wagoner invited her to join the show. What followed was one of the most productive and most complicated professional partnerships in the history of country music. 7 years that produced chart-topping duets, a nationally syndicated television presence that introduced Dolly Parton to audiences who had never heard her name, and a creative dynamic that was, by any honest measure, both deeply generous and deeply controlling in ways that sometimes made those two things indistinguishable from each other. Wagoner negotiated Dolly's recording contract with RCA Victor, a deal that gave her access to the infrastructure, the distribution, and the industry relationships that a young woman from rural Tennessee could not have assembled on her own. He produced her early albums. He introduced her to his audience not as a replacement for Norma Jean, but as something new. And his audience, to their credit, recognized it. Within a few years, Dolly Parton was not merely the female vocalist on the Porter Wagoner Show. She was, increasingly, the reason people were watching. They recorded duets together. The Last Thing on My Mind, We'll Get Ahead Someday, Just Someone I Used to Know, albums that charted consistently and won them the Country Music Association Award for Vocal Duo of the Year in 1970 and 1971. The professional results were undeniable. The personal architecture beneath those results was considerably more complicated. Porter Wagoner was, by his own eventual admission, and by the accounts of nearly everyone who worked closely with him during this period, a man who expressed affection through ownership. He had built something. He had invested in it. He expected a return, not merely a financial one, but a loyalty that in his mind was inseparable from the investment itself. When he helped someone, he expected to remain the person who had helped them. He expected gratitude to function as a permanent condition rather than an acknowledgement that eventually gives way to independence. Dolly, who understood all of this with a clarity she would describe with devastating precision in interviews for the rest of her life, navigated it with the particular combination of warmth and steel that defines her at her best. She later wrote in her memoir, Song Teller, with characteristic directness, that in his mind, he had this idea of owning her. She understood that he had that feeling, but she did not feel owned. That distinction between what he believed the arrangement meant and what she believed it meant is the fault line running beneath everything that follows. It is invisible in the 1967 footage, in the smiling photographs from the early duet albums, in the televised performances where they stood side by side and sang about love and loss with a conviction that was, in its own way, entirely genuine. The fault line does not announce itself. It simply deepens, year by year, as Dolly's star climbs and Porter's grip tightens, until the morning she decided she had to go. She later described him plainly and without particular bitterness as a male chauvinist, someone she fought with constantly, because she would not tolerate the things he expected her to tolerate. That phrasing is important. Not hatred, not contempt, a clear-eyed naming of what he was and what that required her to be in response, which was immovable in the specific, polite Tennessee mountain way that Dolly Parton has always been immovable. Smiling, warm, absolutely unwilling to move. By 1973, Dolly Parton knew two things with certainty. The first was that she was bigger than the show. Not in ego, in fact, in career trajectory, in the direction her songwriting and her voice and her instincts were pulling her. She needed to go solo. She needed to build what only she could build. She had outgrown the frame that Porter Wagoner had given her, and the frame, no matter how lovingly constructed, was still a frame. The second thing she knew was that telling him was going to be one of the hardest conversations she had ever had. Because whatever his flaws, and she named them without flinching, she genuinely loved him. Not romantically, but with the kind of deep, complicated, imperfect love that develops between two people who have spent 7 years making something real together. She did not want to hurt him. She knew she was going to hurt him, and she could not find the words. So she did what Dolly Parton has always done when ordinary language fails her. She wrote a song. There is a particular kind of creative act that exists outside the normal boundaries of songwriting. Not a performance, not a product, not an entry in a catalog, but a private document dressed in melody, written for one specific person, intended to say the thing that conversation cannot hold without breaking. I Will Always Love You is that kind of song. Dolly Parton wrote it in 1973, in a single sitting, in the way that songs which matter tend to arrive. Not constructed, but received, as though the emotion had been waiting patiently for the right sequence of words to carry it out of the body and onto paper. She was not writing for radio. She was not writing for a chart position. She was writing for Porter Wagoner specifically, because she had spent weeks trying to find a way to tell him she was leaving, and every attempt at a direct conversation had collapsed under the weight of his reaction and her own genuine sorrow at causing it. The song solved the problem that language alone could not. It did not accuse him. It did not catalog his controlling behavior or name the specific arguments they had fought through over 7 years. It did not draw the fault line into the open air. What it did, with a precision that only the greatest songwriting achieves, was hold two true things at the same time. I have to go. I love you. Both of those statements are completely honest. Neither one cancels the other. The song exists in the space between them, which is the only honest place the goodbye could have lived. She played it for him. Porter Wagoner, the man from West Plains, Missouri, the man in the rhinestone suit, the empire builder, the host of a show broadcast in more than 100 cities, sat and listened to a 27-year-old woman from Sevier County sing him a farewell. And he wept. He later admitted that he understood immediately what she was telling him. The song was not ambiguous. It was the most loving version of a goodbye he had ever heard, and it broke him open precisely because of that. Because there was nothing in it to argue with, nothing to refute, nothing to hold against her. She was leaving, and she loved him, and those two facts were going to have to coexist in him for the rest of his life. She recorded I Will Always Love You at the legendary RCA Studio B in Nashville on the 12th of June, 1973. The session was, by every account, an extraordinary piece of work, spare, aching, constructed with the kind of restraint that signals absolute confidence in the material. The production did not need to amplify the emotion because the emotion was already doing everything required of it. The single was released in March of 1974 and reached #1 on the Billboard country charts. It stayed there. It became not merely a hit, but a standard, one of those songs that attaches itself to the collective emotional memory of a genre and refuses to let go. Dolly Parton had written it in one sitting as a private message to one man, and it became the defining anthem of country love and loss for a generation. She left the Porter Wagoner show in 1974. The professional separation was real. The departure was final. She was going to build her solo career. The crossover albums, the pop-country hybrid that would eventually make her one of the most recognizable entertainers on the planet. And she was going to do it without the frame that Porter had provided. She was grateful for what he had given her. She was clear-eyed about what staying would have cost her. And she was gone. What happened next, in the music industry, was the kind of thing that reminds you that great songs have lives entirely independent of the intentions of the people who wrote them. In the mid-1970s, Elvis Presley, at that point still one of the most commercially powerful names in American music, wanted to record I Will Always Love You. His manager, Colonel Tom Parker, approached Dolly's team with the standard Presley arrangement. The Colonel, who was not known for his flexibility, requested 50% of the publishing rights as a condition of Elvis recording the song. Dolly Parton said no. She said it politely. She said it without animosity. And she said it with the same immovable quality she had brought to every argument with Porter Wagoner. Warmly, firmly, completely. She later admitted it was one of the hardest decisions she had made in her professional life, because this was Elvis, and the commercial exposure would have been unlike anything she had experienced. But 50% of that song was 50% of something she had written on a piece of paper in a living room as a letter to a man she loved. She was not prepared to give half of it away. Years later, that decision would prove to be one of the most financially consequential acts of artistic self-preservation in the history of popular music. In 1992, Whitney Houston recorded "I Will Always Love You" for the soundtrack of The Bodyguard. The production, built around a long, unaccompanied vocal introduction that gave Houston's instrument room to demonstrate its full, extraordinary range, transformed the song into something that occupied a different category entirely from Dolly's original. It became the best-selling single ever released by a female artist in recording history. It spent 14 weeks at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. It won the Grammy Award for Record of the Year in 1994. The royalties from Whitney Houston's recording of that song returned to Dolly Parton approximately $20 million. $20 million from a song she had written in one sitting as a private goodbye to a man who would, less than 6 years after the song charted, sue her for $3 million and claim she owed him a percentage of everything she had built since she left. That is the particular, stunning arithmetic of this story. And it is not finished yet. Because before we reach the courtroom, before we reach the lawsuit that Porter Wagoner filed against the woman he had helped build into a star, there is one more thing you need to understand about the dynamic between them. One more thing that makes what he did not simply a legal action, but a specific kind of betrayal. The kind that only someone who knows you deeply can execute, because it requires an intimate knowledge of exactly where to aim. How does a man who wept when he heard the song she wrote for him turn that song into the instrument of the lawsuit he filed against her? That question has an answer, and it is not a comfortable one. On the 21st of March, 1979, Porter Wagoner filed a lawsuit against Dolly Parton. The number at the center of the claim was $3 million. He was seeking 15% of Dolly's net income from June of 1974 to June of 1979. 5 years of earnings from a career that had, in that half-decade, transformed from successful to stratospheric. He was also seeking 15% of her recording royalties across the same period. The legal argument, stated plainly, was this: he had made her a star, and he was entitled to a permanent percentage of everything that stardom produced for as long as it continued to produce it. Not for the 7 years they had worked together, for life. Dolly Parton described it later with the kind of compressed, precise clarity she brings to every difficult subject. That Porter Wagoner had filed suit against her for approximately $3 million, claiming he had made her a star and was entitled to a percentage of her career for life. She did not editorialize beyond the facts. She did not need to. The facts were editorializing themselves. To understand what that lawsuit meant, not legally, but personally, you have to understand what Dolly Parton's career looked like in March of 1979, 5 years after she left the Porter Wagoner Show. She had released a string of albums that had moved her from country star to something approaching a genuine American cultural phenomenon. Jolene, recorded in 1973 and released in January of 1974, had reached #1 on the country charts and introduced her voice and her songwriting to an audience that extended far beyond the traditional country market. "I Will Always Love You" had done the same. Her 1977 album, Here You Come Again, a deliberate pivot toward pop production values, had crossed over to the Billboard Hot 100 and earned her the Country Music Association Award for Entertainer of the Year in 1978, making her the first woman in 9 years to receive that distinction. She was being compared to figures outside country music entirely. She was becoming, in the specific American way, a brand, something larger and more durable than a recording artist. Porter Wagoner watched all of this happen. And in March of 1979, he decided that the architecture of their original arrangement entitled him to a share of it. The legal merits of the claim were, by most accounts, genuinely complicated. There had been a management agreement between them. The terms of that agreement and the question of whether it had been properly dissolved when Dolly departed in 1974 were not simple matters of public record. They were contested facts requiring legal interpretation. This was not a frivolous filing. It was a serious lawsuit with a serious dollar figure attached to it, filed by a man who believed, with apparent sincerity, that the investment he had made in Dolly Parton's early career had created an ongoing obligation. But the personal dimension of what he did exists entirely apart from its legal dimension. Porter Wagoner had sat in a room and wept when Dolly sang him the song she had written to soften the goodbye. He had heard her tell him, in the most unambiguous musical language she possessed, that she loved him, genuinely, permanently, in spite of everything. And she still had to go. He had understood. He had said he understood. And then, 5 years later, he had walked into a courthouse and attempted to legally bind her to him for the remainder of her professional life. Which is to say, the remainder of her life, because Dolly Parton does not have a professional life and a personal life. She has one life, and it is inseparable from her work. What he was claiming, beneath the legal language of percentages and royalties and net income calculations, was the thing she had spent 7 years refusing to give him: ownership. She was not going to give it to him. Not in 1973, when she left. Not in 1974, when she built her solo career without him. And not in 1979, when he took her to court. But she was also not going to let this destroy her. That was the specific quality of Dolly Parton's response to the lawsuit. Not rage, not public denunciation, not a counterattack through the press. Something quieter and more devastating. She made up her mind, she later told interviewers, that if he could live with what he had done, she could live without whatever it cost her. That sentence deserves to be held for a moment, because it is not resignation. It is the opposite of resignation. It is a declaration that her peace of mind had a value she was not willing to negotiate away, and that the cost of the settlement, whatever it turned out to be, was worth paying if it meant she never had to be in this position with this man again. The case was settled out of court, by most accounts, around 1980. The exact terms were never made fully public. What has been reported consistently is that Dolly Parton paid approximately $1 million to Porter Wagoner. Not the $3 million he had claimed, but a number that was still, by any measure, a significant sum. She paid it in installments over several years. She did not pay it because she believed he deserved it. She paid it because the cost of fighting him indefinitely, in human terms, was higher than the cost of settling. And then, for years, they did not speak. Not a phone call, not a letter, not an acknowledgement at industry events beyond the minimum that professionalism required. The man who had given her the national platform that launched everything, and who had then attempted to claim ownership of everything that platform made possible. That man became, for the better part of a decade, a silence in her life. Not a wound, she advertised. Just an absence where something complicated used to be. Porter Wagoner continued to record and perform through the 1980s and into the 1990s, though never again at the commercial heights of his earlier career. The industry moved around him. Country music changed. The rhinestone suits remained. He remained. He was still, by every account, a gifted performer and a man of genuine musical intelligence, which is precisely what makes this story so resistant to simple moral summary. The man who sued Dolly Parton for $3 million was the same man who had recognized her talent when she was 21 years old and had no national profile. Both of those things are true. They do not cancel each other. They coexist, uncomfortably, the way truth usually does when it involves actual human beings rather than characters. but the silence between them lasted. And it lasted. And most people, watching from the outside, assumed it was permanent. They were wrong. There is a particular kind of courage that does not announce itself, that does not arrive with a press release or a publicist's carefully managed narrative, but simply appears, quietly, in the form of a woman walking onto a stage to sing a song for a man she has every reason never to sing it for again. Dolly Parton walked onto the stage of the Grand Ole Opry in May of 2007. Porter Wagoner was turning 50 years as a member of that institution. 50 years since the Opry had opened its doors to a young man from West Plains, Missouri, in 1957, and welcomed him into the most storied fraternity in American country music. It was a milestone that deserved to be marked. The Opry marked it, and Dolly Parton, who had every legal, personal, and historical reason to send her congratulations from a comfortable distance, chose instead to be there in person. She sang, "I Will Always Love You," the song she had written in 1973 as a private goodbye. The song that had become a country standard. The song that had generated, through Whitney Houston's 1992 recording, approximately $20 million in royalties. $20 million that existed in part because Dolly had refused to surrender half the publishing rights to Elvis Presley's manager, had held the song intact, had protected it with the same immovable quality she brought to every decision about what belonged to her. That song. She sang it to Porter Wagoner in front of an Opry audience at his 50th anniversary celebration. Porter Wagoner called her one of his best friends that evening. He said it publicly, at the event, in front of witnesses. Not a carefully prepared statement, a spontaneous acknowledgement from a man in the final months of his life of what this woman had been to him and, in spite of everything, still was. To understand what that moment cost, you have to understand what the years between 1980 and 2007 had looked like for both of them. Dolly Parton had spent those years building one of the most extraordinary careers in American entertainment history. The crossover success of Here You Come Again in 1977 had opened a door she walked through with absolute commitment. The 1980s brought film 9 to 5 in 1980, The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas in 1982, Rhinestone in 1984, and then Steel Magnolias in 1989, which demonstrated a dramatic range that surprised critics who had underestimated her. She opened Dollywood in 1986 in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, a theme park that would eventually become one of the most visited tourist destinations in the American South, drawing more than 3 million visitors annually and employing thousands of people from the Appalachian region she had grown up in. She became, in the fullest sense of the word, an institution. Not merely a recording artist or a film actress or a theme park owner, but a specific American idea about what it means to be both fully yourself and fully generous with that self. Porter Wagoner had spent those years more quietly. He continued to record. He continued to perform at the Opry, where his membership was not merely honorific, but active. He was a regular presence, a living connection to the country music of the 1950s and 60s that the Opry exists in part to preserve. He was recognized, consistently, as one of the architects of the genre's mid-century sound, but the commercial momentum of his peak years did not return, and the industry that had formed around him in the 1960s had moved into territories he had not chosen to follow. He remained himself, which is its own kind of integrity. The rhinestone suits, the blonde pompadour, the Ozark boy who had never fully left West Plains, even after West Plains was decades behind him. In 2007, he released an album called Wagon Master that received significant critical attention. A late career record that reminded the industry of what he had always been. Mark Mosher produced it. It featured collaborations with contemporary artists who had grown up listening to him. It was, by any honest assessment, a genuine artistic statement from a man who had been making genuine artistic statements since 1951, and who was not interested in sentimentality for its own sake. The record was good, because he was still good. Whatever else he had done, whatever failures of character the 1979 lawsuit represented, Porter Wagoner was still a musician of real consequence. He was also, by May of 2007, a man who was dying. The lung cancer had been diagnosed. The prognosis was not gentle. He was 80 years old. The boy from West Plains, the butcher's assistant with the radio voice, the empire builder in the rhinestone suit, and he was running out of the particular currency that all of us are given in fixed and non-negotiable amounts. He knew it. The people around him knew it. And Dolly Parton, who has always known things about human beings with a clarity that her warmth sometimes makes easy to underestimate, knew it too. She came to the Opry not because protocol required her to. She came because she had told the truth about this man 34 years earlier in a song, and she had meant every word of it. And she was not the kind of woman who said things she did not mean. After the performance, after the public celebration, after Porter called her one of his best friends, and the Opry audience responded with the kind of sustained, knowing applause that only comes when a room full of people recognizes that something real is happening. After all of that, the months continued to pass. Porter Wagoner's health continued to decline. The cancer did not negotiate. The hospice room in Nashville became the next geography of this story. And the question that now presents itself, the one that this entire narrative has been moving toward since the opening image of a woman reaching for a dying man's hand, is not whether Dolly Parton forgave Porter Wagoner. The question is, what kind of love survives a $3 million lawsuit, a decade of silence, and still finds its way to a hospice room with nothing left to prove and nothing left to ask for? That answer is in the final chapter of this story, and it is the most important thing this story has to say. October 28, 2007. The hospice room, the squeezed hand, and what she carried out of that room into the rest of her life. She went to him. That is the fact at the center of everything. The fact that, when Porter Wagoner was lying in a hospice room in Nashville in the final hours of his life, Dolly Parton did not stay home. She did not send flowers. She did not issue a statement through a publicist expressing her warm regards for a man she had once worked closely with. She went to him in person, and she sat beside him, and she reached for his hand. He was not conscious. He could not speak. He could not, in any medically verifiable sense, hear her, and she went anyway. Because the gesture was not for the cameras, not for the industry, not for the narrative that would eventually be written about both of them. It was for him, and it was for her, and it was for the specific, private truth that she had been carrying since 1973, when she had written him a song that said she would always love him and had meant it in the most unguarded and uncomplicated way a person can mean anything. She said, in the account she gave afterward, with the directness that is her most consistent quality, that she wanted him to be free of anything he might have been worrying about, that she wanted him to leave without the weight of whatever guilt or unresolved feeling he might have been carrying about the lawsuit, about the years of silence, about the particular damage that the 1979 filing had done to something that had genuinely mattered to both of them. She squeezed his hand. He made a movement, small, the kind of movement that a body still produces, even when the conscious mind has largely withdrawn from it. but she read it as understanding. She chose to read it as understanding. And perhaps that choice, the decision to interpret that small, involuntary motion as acknowledgement, as receipt, as a final conversation conducted entirely without words, is the most revealing thing about who Dolly Parton is and has always been. She did not need him to be able to speak. She did not need a confession or an apology or a formal accounting of what he had done and why. She needed to give him something, and she gave it. Porter Wayne Wagoner died on the 28th of October, 2007. He was 80 years old. He died a few hours after Dolly visited. A timeline she has referenced in interviews with a quietness that suggests she has thought about it many times, in private, in the way that all of us eventually think about the moments that we cannot quite categorize as coincidence and cannot quite categorize as meaning, but that live in us permanently regardless. The music industry responded to his death with the kind of sustained, genuine tribute that is only possible when the person being mourned was actually consequential. Not merely celebrated, but formative. He had been a member of the Grand Ole Opry for 50 years. He had hosted a television program that had reached more than 100 American cities at its peak. He had helped to define the visual and sonic language of 1960s country music in ways that are still audible in the genre today. He had, whatever his personal failures, been a man of real artistic substance. Dolly Parton's public statement after his death was characteristically precise. She did not perform grief she did not feel. She did not sanitize a complicated relationship into a simple one. She acknowledged what he had been to her: mentor, partner, adversary, and, in the end, the person she had gone to see in his final hours, because she loved him in the specific way that only people who have genuinely hurt each other can love each other. The love that knows what it costs and pays it anyway. Here is what this story is actually about. It is not about Porter Wagoner's controlling behavior, though that behavior was real and consequential and worth naming clearly. It is not about the $3 million lawsuit, though that lawsuit was a genuine betrayal of the trust that the song had represented. It is not about the $20 million that Whitney Houston's recording eventually returned to Dolly, though that number is one of the most satisfying pieces of arithmetic in the history of popular music, and the detail about Elvis and Colonel Tom Parker remains one of the great small decisions in the history of artistic self-preservation. It is about what Dolly Parton understood in 1973 that Porter Wagoner could not yet understand: that love is not the same thing as ownership, that gratitude is not the same thing as debt, and that a goodbye said with genuine love is not a lesser goodbye than one said with anger. It is a harder goodbye because it requires you to hold the full complexity of what the relationship was, the good and the damage together, and to release the person anyway, without bitterness, without demanding that they be simpler than they were. She wrote a song that did all of that in 3 minutes and 16 seconds. And then she spent the next 34 years proving that she meant it. The man who tried to destroy Dolly Parton died knowing she still loved him. She had told him it was going to happen. In 1973, when she wrote the song, and every single thing that came after: the lawsuit, the silence, the settlement, the Grand Ole Opry anniversary, the hospice room, the squeezed hand, the small movement he made in response. Every single thing was already contained in those words. I will always love you. Not a promise made in happiness, a promise made in full knowledge of what was coming, and kept. If this story moved you, if the particular kind of courage it takes to love someone clearly, without illusion and without surrender, is something you recognize and want to honor, Leave a tribute for Dolly Parton in the comments below. Tell us what her music has meant to you. Tell us what this story made you feel. And ask yourself this: in your own life, have you ever loved someone in spite of everything? Not because it was easy, but because the love was more true than the damage was? Because that is what Dolly Parton spent 34 years demonstrating is possible. If you want more stories like this one, stories about the real lives behind the legendary names, the complicated truths behind the celebrated careers, subscribe to Golden Fame News. Every story we tell is a story worth knowing. And this one, today, on the 25th of August of 2026, on the day the world is remembering Dolly Parton, was one we could not leave untold. She deserved to have it told well.